This is an introductory lesson to memory. How much information can we hold in our memory? Just think about how much you think you could actually hold without having to rehearse it. So, try to think about all the activities that you would go through in a day which require memory. Think about trying to write down everything in the day that you would use your memory for. And then try to think about all the things that you don't use your memory for. And what you're probably going to find is that we actually use our memory for everything, even the slightest thing. So memory is incredibly important. So even getting dressed requires a memory because we have to think about where we've put things, how to put things on, we have to remember how to put our arms into clothes, etc. So without a memory, everything would be a stranger to us and we wouldn't be able to do anything. So memory is incredibly important. Today, the first lesson, we're going to explore the nature of memory. And all that means is to just be able to describe memory. And in psychology, we describe memory in certain ways. So today, we are going to be focusing on short-term memory, and we're going to be looking at capacity. So one way in which we describe memory in psychology is by talking about its capacity. So this lesson is focused on capacity. Just a little bit of background. Memory is part of an area of psychology called cognitive psychology. And I know that you've looked at cognitive psychology because you've looked at the approaches. So cognitive psychologists are looking at the internal processes of the mind. So they look at the way we think, our beliefs, we look at the way that we store information and how they direct our behaviour. So this is very much about internal processes, thought processes. You should again remember this from your unit 2 on approaches, that cognitive psychologists view the mind as a computer, and they use this computer metaphor to try to understand the mind. So the mind is compared to a computer, a series of inputs, processes and output. And we're going to come back to that when we look at the models of memory to see how that will fit in here. So a couple of things about our memory. It has an amazing capacity. It is the evolution of our memories that has largely preserved our species. It's the key to our survival. So it's very, very important. So memory's been studied a lot. It's probably one of the first topics in psychology to have been studied. But what's quite interesting about memory is, remember, we can't see it. So we can't biologically pinpoint a part in the brain. So what is memory, first of all? Memory means to keep hold of. So human memory can broadly be defined as the process by which we retain information about events that have happened in the past. So remember, this doesn't just mean things that have happened years ago. This could mean things in our immediate past, so things that have happened a few seconds ago. Okay, so you have 10 seconds to remember the following numbers. Don't write them down. Now, try to write down as many numbers as you can remember. Right, we're going to come back to that afterwards, because what that will be telling you basically is how much information your memory can hold, and we're also going to see how long. Okay, there are 3 types of memory typically studied in psychology. First of all, sensory memory. Second, short-term memory, which if you look in brackets could be shortened to STM, and you can use that for AQA. And thirdly, long-term memory, which we can shorten to LTM. And basically, when we're looking at memory, memories come in through our sensory memory, which, if you want to think about sensory memory as our 5 senses, so a memory could be a smell, it could be a taste, it could be something visual or a sound. That then goes into our short-term memory, which then goes into our long-term memory. So when we're thinking about memory, we have to think about it in terms of a storage system, a storage unit. And again, we can't visualize exactly what it looks like. But when information comes in through our senses, it's usually only stored for fractions of a second. And this is because we're very quick to process what that memory is, what it is. So is it a sound? Is it a smell? And that literally takes a few seconds for us to register that. Once that's stored in our sensory memory, within a matter of seconds, it's transferred into our short-term memory. I will talk about in a later lesson what happens if it isn't stored there. Our short-term memory is what we're going to focus on today, and it's a system of storing information for brief periods of time. And again, it is quite different with everybody. And then finally, that transfers into our long-term memory. And this is a large store for long-lasting, enduring memories, and we can shorten this to LTM. Today, we're going to focus on capacity. Just before we carry on, think about those numbers that I asked you to remember at the start. Can you still remember them? Can you still remember them in the correct order? And if you can't, this should be telling you something about your memory. Think about what you're learning about your memory with those numbers. So, going back to short-term memory. Short-term memory is a storage system that stores information for brief periods of time. When we talk about our STM, we talk about it in terms of its capacity, its duration, and its encoding. But the focus of today's lesson is on capacity. So, what is the capacity of STM? This is the amount of information that can be stored in STM at any one time. In other words, how much? Work out the following sums in your head. You might have found it hard, you might have found it easy. You probably found that A was easy because that's quite easy to do in your head because you don't have to do much working out. You probably found that B was okay and possible to do, and you probably found that C was quite challenging. Excuse me. Why is that? Well, that's because when you came to do B and C, you were required to hold much more information in your memory than you were being asked with A. And your STM cannot store that much. Now, what would be one way of potentially doing that? It would have been to write it down. So we write something down when we can't hold it in our STM, and it's like a safety net where we write something down so we know we don't have to remember it. In that case, I wasn't allowing you to write it down, you were being asked to do it in your head. So what does that tell us about STM? What can we learn about STM from that? It clearly has a limited capacity because we can do some sums in our head pretty easily, but other sums we need a calculator or we need to write it down, which is a little bit like a sketch pad. So how do we assess the capacity of STM? At the start of this session, I gave you a series of numbers, and that's actually called a digit span. It's a way of assessing how much information your STM can hold. Now go back to those numbers and see how many you could repeat in order. The more numbers there are, the harder it is to remember. If you just want to flick back and have a look at those numbers, see how many you've got correct. Now what's happened during that time is I've distracted you. So unless you wrote them down and kept going back to them and remembering them, you've probably lost a lot of those because of the capacity of your STM. Some of you might have transferred some of them into your LTM. But the reason a lot of them have lost, and we're now going to use a different word, or decayed, is because our STM is so limited. So, what is the capacity of STM? It's often referred to as the magic number 7. And for AQA, if you can say that the digit span for most people for STM is 7 plus or minus 2. So that means generally that most people can remember somewhere between 5 and 9 items. The average is 7 plus or minus 2. And this was developed by a psychologist called Miller. And we are going to have a quick look at his research. And he defined this as the magic number 7. There's another piece of psychological research to support this. If you have a look in your Green Herd Girl book, you'll find this, and it's the work of Jacobs. So here, to support the capacity of STM, it is evidence research based. We need a piece of research to support this, and this would come from Miller or from Jacobs. You can use both if you wish. So Jacobs found something slightly different to Miller, but does also support it. The average digit span for numbers was 9.3 and 7.3 for letters. So how could we increase the capacity? This is another word that you need to be able to understand and you need to write. It's key terminology for AQA, and it's called chunking. And chunking is a method that you've probably used all through your schooling and through your revision, and it's probably the way that we learn a lot of information. And it's basically where we break down information into meaningful chunks so that we can remember it. And if you have a look here, there's a phone number, and that phone number on its own isn't recognisable until we chunk it, and suddenly we chunk it into the area code of 01704. That's the first chunk. Then we break it up to 530, which is the next chunk, and the next chunk is 601. So we've actually taken 11 digits and broken them down into 3. And that's therefore 3 chunks of information to remember. So in other words, we've actually increased our capacity by chunking. Okay, what you need to do now is read the pages in your workbook on capacity. You then need to fill in any gaps at the end of the booklet on capacity. Please make sure that you read the research and understand how and why the research supports this. For a stretch and challenge, I'd like you to consider how useful the research is into capacity. So what are perhaps the problems with it? So if you consider that all this research is experimental, lab-based experimental, you might think that a good thing is that it's very controlled and therefore it's replicable and scientific. However, a problem, of course, is that you could argue that it doesn't tell us a lot about real-life memory because it's done in a lab. And that doesn't actually tell us how we might, for example, remember a shopping list. So have a look, make sure that you've got at least one piece of research to support the capacity of short-term memory. Please use this video as much as you need to, and please refer to the PowerPoint that goes with this and any of the lesson notes. Thank you very much for listening.